Thanks for joining us tonight. This is my first talk for ReactJS Green Bay, but it's also my first talk, so I'm really excited to try this. So looking forward to learning that while I teach you this. So this is a chart that we're making. Basically, it's this line chart. We're going to have data that we plot these different points, we join them by a line, but then we also have some additional features like you can customize label precision, you can customize dimensions, and you can add a grid. And you might wonder, why are we going to build this from scratch? Because there are literally thousands of charting libraries in NPM. A lot of them have a great functionality and really neat features. But I feel like there's three main reasons to do this. One, maybe you have customization that you want to do that you don't feel like is supported by any of these existing libraries. Maybe you don't want to add an additional dependency. But even more important, I think it's great to learn how to build these. That way, when you need to customize a chart from a library, you have the underlying know-how in terms of laying out SVGs, positioning things where you want them. And actually, I'm going to go a little bit beyond what my original blog post did. And at the end of this, I'm going to take a recharts chart, which is a really popular library. I'm going to use what we learned here to extend that and have like some customization. So primarily, the way that you get started is you just draw out what you want to build. And I found in building this line chart, which was the line chart that I used in an actual client project, I found it was really important for me to keep track of what I'm actually trying to plot. I happen to use a diagramming software called Lucidchart, which you can see pictured here. And you can see I had to do a lot of different diagrams to keep everything straight, but you can really use anything, even just a pencil and paper. Okay, so let's just dive into it. The first thing that you have to understand when you're laying things out with SVG is your origin is this top left corner. So you can see I've added the arrows that point to the left and point down, and there's the 0, 0. We're keeping that in mind because as we lay these the lines out and as we lay our guides out, we are going to have to flip things vertically. Otherwise, our chart will start up here in the corner. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to lay out our y-axis and our x-axis. And basically, you start with three main variables. You're going to do your desired height and width, as well as your font size, which eventually feeds into this padding, which is green. So throughout this whole walkthrough, I'm going to be referencing, here's our chart area. This is where we're actually having lines and points. Outside of the blue and the green, that's where we'll have some labels, both for the X and the Y axis, and then a title eventually. So the way I did it was I based my padding off of the font size and also the number of digits that we're going to need to display here in this padding. I have a little code sample here. I'll show it more in context, but basically what I did was I took the maximum of the Y from my data. So if you think about all the data points that you have and you think of all the Y values for those, what's the maximum? Earlier I mentioned you want to perhaps allow custom precision, like you want to have decimal points or not. You keep that in mind by using toFixed, and then how long is that number? So if your maximum is 100 and you want 2 decimal points, that's what 6 characters, and then I just added 1 for space. So what I thought looked good was the desired font size that I had, those number of digits, and then multiplied it by 3. So basically there's not like an exact formula for this. It's just what you think looks good based on what font you're using and based on the data set. So if you think what range you might be in. So let me show you the code. And I'm just going to be hopping from different tags, which at the end of this, I'll share a repository that has all of these branches and tags, so you can go and see exactly where I was when I was walking through this. But in this case, I'm in the axes, and you can see here, I'm just doing exactly what I just described. I'm finding the maximum Y from my data, and my data actually looks like this. So this data is imagining you have a data point for each day of the week. So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then our X values are just the position of that day of the week. And then Y values, these are just kind of random, just values that I came up with as an example. And so the maximum from that, which I think was like 500, I'm converting that to a string, then I'm getting a float, and I'm finding getting the fixed precision. So in this case, I want 2 decimal places. Adding some, getting what the length was of that. So I think that would be 6, and then adding 1, so 7. Using that formula that I came up with that I thought looked good. And then I have my, let's see. I go back to my diagram, and this is kind of where plotting this out is really helpful, because if you think about, okay, so I want to have this much padding, then my y-axis is going to start at a xy coordinate of padding and padding. And so if that was like ended up being 50 pixels or something, it would be 50, 50. And then it would be whatever my desired height was. So then X stays the same. And then I just have the total desired height. So that's the height of the chart plus the padding minus one of these padding. So it only goes to this point, doesn't go all the way to the end. Same with going the other direction. Start with our X padding, and that's height minus padding to place us here. Same thing here, height minus padding, and then width minus padding. And then what we end up with is, and this is kind of faint, but there's an X and Y axis here. So now that we have our canvas, we can start plotting out our points. So a common theme that's just going to keep coming up as we plot all these things out, now that we have our container, is ratio. And it makes sense because you are laying things out in relation to all of the other points that are on your chart, or all of the other guides that are on the chart. And the points are a great starting place to be considering this, because you can kind of think of it as, if we have any particular point that we want to lay out, and we think about, okay, so I have this X value, and like, let's say this was 1 or something, you would divide it by whatever your max was. So if that's 1, maybe this is 8 or something. So that's 1/8 of the way across. You multiply it by your width so that you know where to lay it out on the SVG canvas itself. And then because we have this padding around here, we also want to offset it. So we push it into the actual chart area and leave our padding unoccupied until we need to place labels and things that actually belong in that gutter. And then plotting lines with SVG is really simple. You just give it a string that's made up of a number of points, and then you give it a stroke, a width. There are other attributes that you can use, but these are the basic ones. And so to get into the nitty-gritty of how do we get from our data set to a string that the polyline can use, is we map over our data points, which, just to remind you, our data looks like this. So we map over our data points. And for each point we say, and in this case, I'm calling the point an element. We say, for the X value of that element, I want to know what is the ratio of that to the maximum X value from our data. Multiply it by the chart width, and then add the padding so that I can push it out of the gutter. Same with the Y value. I'm taking the Y value from that data point, finding the ratio of that value to the maximum Y from the data, multiplying it by the chart height, and then adding the padding. But because the origin of the SVG, let me go backwards. So the origin of SVG is opposite from the origin of what a typical chart would have. We need to flip it. And so that's why we do chart height minus all of those things. So it just inverts it. And then the format that the polyline is expecting are these XY comma separated pairs with spaces in between. And I can show you what that looks like in our code. So that's here. It's exactly what I just walked through. And then we just take the points and we pass it into the polyline. And it ends up looking like this. So in my opinion, that's really pretty simple for, going from nothing to having a chart that maps out our polylines. So I find personally it gets kind of addicting. Like once you know how to start laying things out, you want to do it a lot and like roll your own. So be careful of that, because a lot of times the charts out there will be really the libraries out there will be the best option, but it's fun to build your own too. That's what CodePen is for, right? Okay. So then, like I said, ratios are going to come up a lot. And so when we're doing our Cartesian grid, I'm going to show you horizontal and vertical quickly. We have to start again with a ratio. So we think about how many guides do we want? And by the guides I'm thinking of are these guides that go across. You say, how many guides do I want? And then for each guide that you want to lay out, you say, okay, what's the ratio of that to the number of guides I want, so that I can lay them out evenly along the different axes. And we start with a zero-based index +1, because since you already have your X and Y axis, if you can put a guide there, but it's just going to overlap with the axis you already have in place. So with the horizontal guide, our X will always be the same, because they're just going to line up with these edges of our chart. So the start will be the same value as our padding, because we just push it over that much. And then our end will be the total width of our SVG minus the padding on this side. For the Y value, you'll do the height of our chart. So the height of our chart here is this total height minus padding here and padding here. So padding times 2. And then we subtract that from the height chart again to invert it. And then we add our padding to push it down that way. Vertical guides are similar. The math is just a little bit different. We use the exact same ratio. In this case, our Y value is always going to be the same. So we'll start with padding, because we're pushing it down from the top. And then our end will be the height minus the padding. So imagine like a line going all the way down to here, but then we subtract that padding. And then our X value, we use that ratio that we calculated, and then multiply it by the width of the total SVG element. And then we just subtract the padding on each side. So then we would so that lays out our line, and then we just push it into the chart. So we add this padding on the left. And that ends up looking like So then we have our Cartesian grid. And the way that I set this up in the code is I have horizontal guides and vertical guides. And I have, for my line chart component, you can just pass in the number of guides that you want, horizontal and vertical guides. And the code looks just like what I described. For the example of a horizontal guide, you have the start of your X value, the end of your X value. It's going to be the same for each guide that you set up. And then the way that you come up with a number of guides basically out of nothing, because they're kind of arbitrary, is you create an array and you say how many guides that you want to have. You fill it with 0. So this is how you can initialize an array of however many objects. Then we map over it and we take the index of each of the guides in our array. We calculate that ratio that keeps coming up. And then in this case, we need to figure out what our y coordinate is. And so we say it's the chart height minus chart height times ratio plus padding. And we just use another polyline. And the format of the points that it takes is exactly the same. It's the pairs of coordinates separated by a space. And then we can just drop those into our chart like that.
So you do have one question that came in.
Okay.
Or was it answered? I don't know if Nico, if you saw that. Oh, never mind. Yep, Nico answered it.
I think I just answered it.
Okay.
Yeah, I just answered, Jacob. The question was from Zach. He mentioned, Kelsey, that since we're dividing each element's y value by the maximum, whichever one's the highest y value will always be at the very top of the chart. So that's correct.
Yeah.
Hey, Kelsey, just real quick, do you mind talking a little bit more about SVG in general?
Oh, sure.
I know that you're using Polyline and SVG here, but for those that haven't really done much SVG, maybe just a quick run through of, what is that SVG tag and how what's going on?
Sure. So I have a link here as well that I'll just put up in the background. So SVGs are scalable vector graphics, and I find them really helpful in that they have a similar syntax to HTML, the Markdown is. And so basically, like I was describing a minute ago, you have this origin here up at the top where you're starting with 0, and you give it you give your SVG a view box, and so that's where our width and height are utilized in our actual code. And when you lay things out, you're doing it within the you're laying them out within this paradigm, I guess would be how I would describe it. So you're saying that our view box is going to be like, let's say 100 by 100. And so whenever you're laying out your points or your x-axis or your y-axis, you're saying where within those 100 units left to right, or those 100 units top to bottom, am I placing these elements? And there's a lot of different elements, and I only use a handful of them here. So I use Polyline, and then I also use, later on, I'll use text and T-span and circle, but there's a lot of different elements that you can use. And they're all going to use things like X or Y or some variant of them in order to be positioned within your SVG element. But you can really take it a lot of places.
Cool.
And that's why I had mentioned earlier, like CodePen, you can find people making really neat things in CodePen using SVG. And the Indian web docs that I pulled up as well have a lot of really great examples, especially, figuring out how to use particular elements. It's really helpful to just look them up and see exactly what the different attributes that they accept are and what they'll do based on what value you pass them.
Awesome. Yeah, for myself, most of my experience with SVG has been mostly around like icons and logos, and SVG allows you to pass in, essentially pass in some JavaScript into the actual icon code. So for example, being able to set a color, you essentially have the icons kind of metadata, and then at runtime, you can fill in the code. You can fill in the color, the size, and all these other things with JavaScript. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe I kind of glossed over this, but the idea of it being scalable, you don't when you use like a PNG or a JPEG, if you scale it up too large, you lose fidelity, or it starts to look blurry. And so with SVGs, because you're laying them out with relational points, they are scalable. So as you make it bigger, it stays just as crisp. And that's why we can do things like pass in different heights and widths, and it just adjusts to what arguments we pass in. Okay, so just one more component that we have to add to our chart. Or was there something else?
Yeah, real quick. We have one more question about SVGs. Okay. From Shai. The question is, the numbers in the view box and in the polyline, do those represent pixels?
They represent the proportion. I'm forgetting the word. Because you can give it 100 by 100, but then you can have it fill, like those are your units. And then you can have it fill a containing div that you say is 800 pixels. So it's really more proportional. And that's why it's so great that it's scalable, because if your view box is 100 by 100 and you place a circle at 50, 50 right there in the center, and you scale your rectangle or square larger or smaller, the circle stays right in the center. So it's adaptable. So you can see how that would be helpful on different size screens, especially like mobile development. If you can have something that will just fit to whatever, if you're using a phone or if it's a desktop, you could say, I want it to scale up to a maximum of 500 pixels or something along those lines.
Okay, cool. So if say that you were making this chart be 100 by 100, if you were to make it 10 by 10, it would still fill up the space. Cool. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, that's why I think that's, it's a really good question. Another thing too is, you can position things in the SVG. They're outside of the view box. So if you can think of that as kind of like a window, and so then you can have things animate in and out of view. So that can be a neat thing that you do. Okay, so the last thing that you have to do within your SVG is add labels. Similar thing again, like for x-axis labels in this example, you figure out your ratio here. So that's the index here of this element divided by the max of your x values. You multiply it by the width here, and then you will add padding to push it away from this gutter and into the right position. And then in my case, I'm also positioning it then back half of the value of my font size, because I happen to know in this case, and this is kind of a limited case, so this is a caveat when you're setting these up, is I know that my data labels are all 1 or 2 characters because they represent the days of the week. So M for Monday, T for Tuesday, and so on. And so I know that I can position it center of the text under the tick mark by just moving it back half of a character width. And that's in this case. If you thought that would be more variable, you would need to adjust accordingly and have a little bit more of a nuanced approach. This just worked for this use case. And then for my Y value, so how far up and down I want to position my labels. Here, finally, we're actually using this green gutter. And so we take the total height of our chart or SVG, and then we subtract padding. So that brings us here to the x-axis. And then we add font size ×2. So that basically just pushes it down 2 lines so that we have some space between our x-axis and our labels. And I'll show you that in the code. So yeah, so here I'm figuring out what the Y value will be, height minus padding, and then we just add some space between our x-axis and our label text. And I'm iterating over the data. That way I can look at the X value because that's what I really want to label. Because as you remember from the data set, each day of the week has their own X value and it's just the index here. And so I get that ratio here, and then I multiply it by the chart width and then add the padding to push it away from the edge. And so here's another SVG element. This one is text, and you can give it these different style attributes in the same way that you would CSS. One of the differences, though, is it uses fill instead of color, but I can still use things like font family. And then I just pass it this element label. So that will be where the M for Monday or T for Tuesday come from. And y-axis is similar. In this case, what I do is I keep in mind, if there is a number of horizontal guides that I want to show, I want to have a label for each of those guides. And so that's how I come up with how many labels to come to render, versus here I'm just doing one for each data element. With my y-axis labels, I do one for each guide. Yeah, and here's also where the precision comes into play. So whatever precision you pass in, you can have it display. And that ends up looking like that. So this is basically all that we do within the SVG to create our chart. Something that you might remember from math class is that you have to also put labels. So under the X, to the side of the Y, and then also give a title to your chart so you know what you're charting. And I just decided in this case to do that outside of the SVG. So for the title, for example, I just made a different React component, and I just render that above my line chart. And I've said the text is going to be movements per day of the week. And then I use CSS grid to just lay the different components out. So this chart title is actually outside of the SVG. So I won't go super into detail on that, but if you want to see the code, it's going to be in the repo and in the blog post. And so that just lays that out there. And I like having it outside of the SVG because you may want to treat it like a header in the same way that you would treat any of the other headers on your page. Same with axis label, same thing. So I made these label components. I pass in the text, and then for this y-axis label, it has a rotate attribute so that it will rotate it to the left. So how you would expect to see a label on a y-axis. Okay, so like I said, I built this originally for a client project, so it was something that actually got used, or something similar, not exactly like this, but same concept. But probably where you're going to find it most useful in your day-to-day to know how to use these concepts is in things like extending recharts. So in a different client project, we had a case where we wanted to add a label kind of like this. So it's a rectangle that has some text inside it, has some brand colors that they use, and then it had this line that connected it. And I knew that based on the position of this point, I could lay all of these different components out appropriately. So it would have the look and feel that I wanted. And then also taking into account these kind of tricky cases where if I had just done the same layout as I did for this dot up here, that's really close to the edge of my chart, it would have pushed my rectangle and label just completely out of the view. And when you push things out of your viewport, like I said earlier, it just cuts it off. And so you may have these cases where you need to understand how do all these numbers working together impact the view, and how can I conditionally display things. So in this example, I'm flipping it over and showing it under the dot because that's where I have room. And the code for that kind of almost ends up looking more confusing than the other code, but just because it's more of a complex look. So using recharts, I just imported their components. So line chart, x-axis, line, and y-axis. And it does make it really, really fast. I mean, you saw the code that we had to write to do it manually, but here we just use their line chart and then pass it the x-axis and y-axis, and then have a line here, and we say what our data key is going to be. I won't go super into how to use recharts, but just to give you a high-level overview. One of the options, though, that recharts gives us is we can use a custom dot component. And in my case, I only want to show one of them. So I use this target prop, and I write a custom dot component. I use the props that get passed in by recharts. And then I can do math like this, where I say, if I have a rectangle that's 50 by 125, and I want to push it up 60 60 units from my dot, I can do math here to say, well, if I have a y value that's for my dot, which is cy here because they're anticipating you placing a circle. And so a circle has a cy and a cx, and that's where the origin is placed on your SVG. I say my cy minus the height of my rectangle that I want to draw minus the y offset that I want to use. If that's less than 0, then I know I've pushed it off of the screen or out of the viewport. And so in that case, I can just invert it. And so in that case, I say, okay, so wherever I place my rectangle top to bottom and where I place that connecting line top to bottom is going to be dependent on this invert calculation. So this is going to be true or false. So if it's true, I can use this formula. If it's false, I can use this formula. And then similarly, I lay out my connecting line, my rectangle. This is another component that you can use with SVGs, another element. And just using math similar to what I walked you through in detail, I can lay these elements out. Text is another, or I guess I showed you text earlier, but T-span is an element that you can use with text to show your text on separate lines and just do some more nuanced layout with your text within your SVG. And so that one ends up looking like, oop, did I not? Oop. Sorry, switching back and forth between all these commits, my node modules must have got mixed up.
Yeah,
Anyway.
This has happened to me. So
Yeah.
you gotta re npmi again.
Yep, I'm doing it here. Anyway, it ends up looking like this, where it either displays it here where you have enough room, or it displays it here if you don't have enough room above it.
Hey, Kelsey, we have a question about the y-axis ticks, I believe.
Okay.
So the question is that because the XY coordinates are go from the top left, the text is not aligned with the y-axis, and you can see that in these in the bottom label there, the 0.00. So they're all left aligned instead of being aligned with the axis. So the question is, would there be an easy way to align it to the right, to align that text? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Let me see.
I think you do have it aligned. Oh, sorry. In the bottom example, you do have the 0 aligned. I think that's what they mean.
Yes. Yeah, I see what they mean. Yeah, and I should have said alignment. When I'm thinking of alignment, I'm thinking like top and bottom. So like this line, if it continued over, it would go through the middle of the 100. But I see what they mean, like this 0 being lined up with this 0. I think. Let me go to my line chart. Just off the top of my head, that may be something like text anchor right or something along those lines. See if that made any difference. No, you would have to play with it, and that's where going to MDN docs that I showed earlier, which I have in the presentation linked very first. That's where that would be really helpful to think about what part of my element am I looking at when I'm aligning it on within the canvas. And so a lot of times it's just going to be the top left corner, but you can use different attributes like, and I did it in the recharts example, funny enough, you can use things like text anchor and alignment baseline to say, okay, I'm actually not interested in aligning it based on that top left corner. I'd rather be looking at the exact center, because that a lot of times is an easier way to position something. And that's more consistent versus, different words can be of different lengths or even number values. And so, yeah, I would recommend going to those docs and looking at these different attributes.
Awesome. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here's just the example of adjusting so that you can fit your label. Yeah, and so besides just pointing you all to some other great resources, and then also a text detailed walkthrough of the steps that we just took in the repo, that's all I got for y'all.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this was awesome. I like you went a little bit farther than you went in the blog post, which was really cool to see that being implemented in recharts. So yeah, thanks, Kelsey. Really glad that you came on, and I think this was super informative for myself, and I'm sure for a lot of other people. So yeah, I'm not sure, Jacob, what the how we can open this up for questions. Maybe is that something that we've been doing through the Q&A or?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions about beyond what was answered, whether it's even, maybe it's just about SVGs, maybe it's about just other ways that this can be done, or any questions for Kelsey or Nico, now's the time. So either in the chat or the Q&A is easier for us to manage questions, but if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in there.
All right, cool. All right, we got a comment, not a question. Justin says he struggled with Victory for days. Wish I had this background information before starting there.
Yeah, we just we used Victory in a project I was recently working on, and we positioned some labels. I'm actually not even sure the extent of what kind of charts you can make with Victory, but what we were making was a radial chart that would say tracking progress and saying you're 60%, so it would fill a radial chart 60%. And yeah, positioning things in the middle of that, like if you wanted to put the percent and maybe a label, knowing the XY coordinates and how to lay things out like that is really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit about some. I think it would make sense to discuss some of our favorite graphing libraries. Jacob, you can start.
Me? You know, as a person that does a lot of marketing, I love all of them. They're all good.
I'm not sure. I know for some of your projects, Kelsey, you probably used a couple of other things, but we've been using for the project that I'm on, we started using Nevo, which is I don't think it's as popular as something like recharts or D3, but it's surprisingly simple. It's like very high level, so you don't really get to customize too much, and it was great. We had a lot of success with it. For some of the requirements that we got, I think we had to dip into recharts for like a few. I think we had some overlap, like a line chart that also had a bar chart behind it with different data. We had to do a little bit of rechart, but overall, Nevo was really a great choice. And I've been really tempted to like fork it and just call it Nico. And then so their domain is nevo.rocks, and nico.rocks is available. So I'm saying I could steal some traffic from them very easily.
How much is nico.rocks? You better not be letting that out on live stream. Somebody's gonna price gouge you.
We can scratch that later, right, Jacob? We'll just take that out.
No, it's too late. We do have a question though from Shai. It's she asks, if it's not too difficult, can you show or explain an example for implementing animation, maybe on hover with the table?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do SVG elements have the same? Do they respond to some of the same event handlers that normal HTML elements do?
You can apply classes to SVG elements in the same way that you can other HTML elements. And like other HTML elements, there are limitations. I don't think I could quickly live code an example right here because I am not sure how to inline do like transformations and hover things like that, those specific selectors. But another thing is a lot of these libraries like recharts have that stuff built in for you as well. But basically, if I was to describe the steps that I would take for Shy, I would have a hover selector for a class, apply that class to the element, and then have on hover like transform, translate however many units I need to move it left or right or up or down. You can do the same thing with changing fill and all that. It's definitely possible. I don't think I could demo it right now though.
Yeah, it seems just from reading some CSS tricks about SVGs, it seems like you would have to attach a class and then do some transformations on it. A lot of jQuery on this page. Not very happy with it. But
I do have an example, if I have time to show, of animating. I think I have it, of animating SVG. Somebody put a bunch of practice projects on my Mac though, and now I can't find it. It definitely wasn't me, except for it was.
We have a good comment from Andrew. He says, super cool presentation. Were the client projects you built these for intended to be static charts, or were you taking in a feed of data that would update periodically?
So the idea is that the data would update continuously. So you would be getting the, in this case, it was movements or whatever you're tracking day to day. It was supposed to be showing you, here's your average movements for a Tuesday. Here's your average movements for a Wednesday. So that would be continuously updating. And in my example where I showed a really simple just object with some, or I should say it was an array with different objects in there. In a real world example, or in our client project example, that was coming from an API. I wanted to show I don't know, Nico, if you remember the animation learn something that I showed one Monday, but there is a really good YouTube video out there that I'll ask Jacob to include. But I learned initially how to animate SVGs using, I learned from this YouTube video where just somebody did kind of like what I did here, where he walks through how to do it. So I'll send that to Jacob so he can include it in the post talk resources.
Yeah, that'd be
Awesome.
great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't find my project that I made. Yeah,
no worries. We for everybody listening, we'll send out all the resources and the code sandbox links and all that stuff. We'll put it in a nice little package for everybody, and we'll include that too, Kelsey. So yeah, I mean, one more time, just thanks for putting this together. This was really awesome, and I'm looking forward to more blog posts from you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.